Good morning to most, good afternoon to others, and good evening to the viewing audience across the pond. I am your host, Jason Miles, here for another episode of This is Revolution Podcast. If you're new to the channel, thank you so much for joining us on what is to be a lovely Saturday afternoon for me here in Baja. If you're a returning listener, subscriber, welcome. So glad to have you here with us. We've had another busy week of shows here at TIR. After the Wednesday night show, I drove to Irvine, where I interviewed Catherine Liu in person. We had a film crew record us, but sadly, my mic got disconnected during the filming, and the crew was unaware. Still hear me, but the volume's a bit low. That being said, watching the interview back with y'all was fun, and Catherine is one of my favorite people to interview. The video is up, and Catherine even took some viewer questions afterwards, so make sure you check that out. Also on Tuesday, YouTube pulled our show down.
We coming for you, nigga.
That's how it felt. They said we violated community standards with the intro video that you just saw. That's what they said, that we violated standards with literally the intro video that we start off every show with. But I changed the title on the show and was able to re-upload it, and it's there. They're just fine. Also, want to remind everyone that since we're in July, it's Star Wars month. We'll be watching Star Wars and Star Wars adjacent movies. We started off the month by watching the 1984 classic, The Last Starfighter. A lot of fun. And tomorrow, we'll be watching Rogue One. Maybe one of the best Star Wars movies. I'm really looking forward to seeing that. If you want to join us for these fun movie nights, there's only one way. Become a patron for as little as $3 a month or $30 for the year. You can have access to champagne rooms past and present. Join us for these fun movie nights and more. Now, on to the depressing topic of the day, the latest from Revol Press, Flowers for Marx. I have a couple of the authors from that book on the show today, Ben Burgess and the Matt McManus. The rapper Tupac once described inner city youth as a rose that grew from concrete, a delicate and beautiful thing sprouting up in the harshest conditions. In their latest release from Revol Press, Flowers for Marx, Ben Burgess and Matt McManus offer a vision of Marx as that same kind of rose growing through the concrete jungle of neoliberalism. But this rose, it's often mocked, called a weed, even marked for destruction. This book, Flowers for Marx, isn't just theory, it's a counterattack, a defiant blooming in the face of bipartisan, capital-backed efforts to stamp out socialism. Today, we're diving deep into two essays from the collection. We'll be talking with the authors themselves, Matt McManus on Marxist humanism, and Ben Burgess on analytical Marxism. I can't speak. Please welcome my good friend and sometimes neighbor, Ben Burgess.
What?
And also, coming all the way live from a secret bunker somewhere in Ann Arbor, Matt McManus.
Yeah.
So, I want to talk with you, Matt, about Marxist humanism.
Sure.
Your essay in defense of Marxist humanism opens with a bit of a jab at Marxists who treat Marxist texts like scripture. You write that to treat Marx's writings as holy writ misunderstands Marx himself, since if material conditions are determinate, then doctrinally, I was saying that totally wrong, and charged arguments over academic esoterica aren't likely to positively influence politics a whit. So I wanted to start there. What's the danger in treating Marx as dogma, and how does this kind of holy book Marxism actually hold the left back?
Well, I'm sure that you've encountered this. Probably everyone has at least once or twice online, right? You get into a debate about this or that subject matter, and inevitably people don't just turn to Marx for guidance, but they almost turn to him the same way that people will turn to scripture. And rather than engaging in substantive debates or discussions about the issue at hand, instead we get involved in these very nebbish, very scholastic debates about what did Marx mean here, and how does what he said here contradict or potentially overlap with what he said in another place. And what I just wanted to point out is that if you look at Marx's method and indeed his attitude throughout life, there's very little about his writing or his thinking that is dogmatic or let alone insular, right? And certainly not scholastic. So in the Grundrisse, Marx lays out the kind of bones of his method pretty effectively, right? Where he says, look, you always have to start with the concrete. These are just basic facts about the social world, right? I go to next door and a bag of chips is $3.50, right? Or $5 with inflation now, which is kind of a pain in the ass, right? That's a social fact about how much commodity costs when I go next door to the grocery store. But then beyond that, we need to develop general laws about why it is social facts are a certain way. And what Marx says is consequently we need to move from the concrete to thought, right? We need to think about, well, why is it that chips cost $3.50 one day and then sadly $5 the next sometimes with inflation? We say, well, it might be because of this or it might be because of that, these kind of general social tendencies. But then ultimately he says we can never sit there and rest easy with the knowledge that we've now ascertained what these social laws are. We need to kind of check those social laws and their relevancy against changing facts on the ground. And of course, this is foundational to Marx's historical materialism, because what might be a law operating in economics during one epoch won't necessarily be a law that is operative in the next one, because of course circumstances change. And so what you see when you apply this method is a very fluid, very transient, and very open-textured kind of approach to the study of social reality. It's not one that's rigid and locked in for all time. And I just get very frustrated by not just Marxists, but also critics of Marx, who see him as a much more rigid, dogmatic, quite frankly, boring thinker than he actually is.
You're muted, Jason.
You want to add anything to that?
No, I mean that. I think Matt covered that fairly nicely. I would, I would co-sign all of that.
Except,
Yeah, but
yes,
yeah.
Except completely fucking wrong. I almost left. I was so mad about it. No, I think that's I think that's all right, and I think that's all very well said. I mean, this is. I think that you do get oftentimes this this weird tendency to like treat Marx as wholly writ when when you're not like taking you're not taking him the way you would take any other historical thinker, right? Like it's here's the here's the argument he's making for his position. I think this this premise still makes sense, this one really doesn't, right? This like whatever, right? Like this is and I think oftentimes this tendency to not do that, right, with Marx, right, to just sort of take Marx said it to be almost sufficient for thinking it's true, is sort of bound up with this idea that there's this like special way that Marx or Marxists can figure out the truth, that that you don't have to just kind of make arguments and evaluate evidence like anybody else, that you're like you're having like dialectical insights about the totality or whatever, right? Like I think that's the kind of thing that in my experience tends to be tied up with this.
Matt, you also argue that Marxism needs normative commitments, that we just can't analyze the world. We need to take moral positions about what's wrong and what's worth fighting for. So let me ask you directly, what does a Marxist moral framework actually look like to you? And what do you say to those on the left who say morality is a bourgeois distraction?
Well, I'd say you just need to look at Marx's text very carefully, right? It's not like he ever gave up making normative or moral arguments. There's this kind of classical, largely Althusserian thesis, although it has roots even in Engels' works, that holds that after a certain point in his career, Marx kind of shifted from being a humanist moralist who was critical of capitalism and bourgeois society on behalf of a kind of superior vision of society to becoming a scientific socialist, right? Somebody who talked about how the laws of history, as they were unfurled, indicated that communism was coming whether you wanted it to or not. And I just don't think it's textually true, right? As late as things like the Civil War in France or the Critique of the Gotha program, you still see Marx making quite overt and normative arguments about the nature of exchange, about what political system would be the best one to replace bourgeois democracy with, or for that matter, aristocratic rule with. And, you also see him stress the idea that a society that develops human capacities as an end in and of itself is a higher or superior society compared to one that doesn't do that, like capitalism, which just tends to foster certain kinds of human capabilities because those are useful for capital, certainly in the lives of the poor. So I think that this kind of distinction between a scientific Marx and a humanist ethical Marx, with the implication being that the latter just disappeared, doesn't really hold water if you look at his writings carefully. But I think that the more important argument that I wanted to make is just that there's really no getting around making moral arguments for the superiority of socialism if you want to develop a cogent set of arguments for socialism, right? It's almost, to me, a little bit odd that that needs to be said. So for a long time, as Cohen points out, and Ben talks about this in his essay, there was this assumption that the dialectic of history showed that communism, socialism were the future. This is sometimes referred to as the obstetric thesis, right? The idea that socialists are just going to give birth to the new society that's coming one way or another. But that really lost a lot of plausibility after the fall of the Soviet Union, and certainly, in the years since. I don't think any of us, except for the truly dedicated, let's call it that, just believe that socialism is inbound one way or another. And with the kind of fall or the disillusionment around the obstetric thesis came the necessity of actually saying, well, first off, this is why socialism will be superior. And here also is what a plausible socialism could look like that could adequately actually give birth or instantiate those kinds of value systems. So I don't think that there's any getting away from making moral arguments. I think that Foucault and socialists just assumed that they didn't have to for a long time, and that's just really not plausible. It ever was.
Ben, you look like you want to chime in.
Do I? Yeah. I mean, I definitely agree with all of that. I mean, I think that to me, this issue about making explicitly normative arguments about what's good or bad, right or wrong, what should or shouldn't happen, is really just an issue of self-awareness, right? In other words, like, nobody anywhere doesn't have normative views. It would be impossible. I mean, I think that's just too basic to what humans are like. And, certainly nobody who cares about politics doesn't have normative views that guide that, right? So I think if you do want to say, morality, like caring about morality, making arguments about justice or whatever is, bourgeois idealism or whatever, that doesn't actually mean that you're going to stop having like background principles about what should happen, what's right or wrong, what's just or unjust, that inform your politics. Of course you will. It just means you're not going to talk to them about them, and maybe you're not even going to think about them, right? Whereas I would say that, I mean, just given the absolute inevitability of making moral judgments, I think it's better to be consciously aware of like what moral judgments you're making, so you can like reason about whether they make sense.
If I could just add one thing to that, I think that your point about making explicit is very important, and I've stressed this on other occasions, so I'll just do that very briefly here. But I think that most socialists, even those who did hold to the obstetric thesis, said, well, socialism is going to be higher because we're going to have a more free and a more equal society. And those are just prima facie good. And one of the things that my analytical brain wants to stress is it's not prima facie good that we want a more free, equal society, right? It's not even prima facie obvious that human flourishing is a good in and of itself, right? Now, I think that equality and freedom and human flourishing are all good. And I think a society that secures those for the most people is a better society than one that doesn't, right? But you have to make the argument for that. And if this all seems like scholastic nitpicking, I would say just go look
Yeah,
at the
yeah.
right now, right? Plenty of them don't think that a freer and more equal society is a good society, right? They think that actually a less free, certainly for others, and less equal society is a good one. So we have to make the case for the opposite.
Yeah, well, and also there's like even if you say, freedom is good, I mean, there's a question about what kind of freedom, right? Because
Absolutely.
this is, obviously lots of people would say that, the kind of freedom that matters the most is, freedom from state intrusion, freedom from having your wealth redistributed. Like these are very these are very popular ideas, right? Like, I mean, this is even I mean, we literally just had the big beautiful bill that was passed, that all of the sort of horrific shit in it was justified by justified to many people by the fact that it had tax decreases, right? And like that sort of
for Social Security.
yeah
Yeah.
that
getting SNAP benefits for children, but rest easy knowing that Jeff Bezos is going to be buy another yacht with us, right? Personally, it helps me sleep much easier.
As it should.
Yeah, because one day you might be Jeff Bezos.
I might, yeah, or my nephew, my brother-in-law, my son,
we talked about this, and I don't want to dwell on this too long. We did a show about the big beautiful bill, and I'm not the biggest believer that everyone thinks they're a millionaire in waiting. I do believe that a lot of people have like emotional attachments to stuff, and there's this belief that socialism / communism is going to take your stuff away, make stuff harder to get, just change the world around you, and you're just going to live in some sort of end times Soviet hellscape of bread lines and ugly clothes.
Mm-hmm.
No more Jordans.
Yeah, no, for sure, right? I mean, this is this is maybe also kind of the other half of what Matt's talking about, along with the thing about moral arguments, that what kind of went with that obstetric metaphor, that the new society is waiting to be born. It's just a question of like how quickly you give birth to it and making sure that you don't have such a bad miscarriage that we're going to be going back into barbarism or whatever. That part of what went along with that, right, was, well, we don't have to think too hard about the kind of new society that we want. And so that gets you off the hook for two things. One of those is the one we were just talking about, which is about moral values, right? I mean, like what do we think is just, and how does that inform what kind of society we want or doesn't want? But the other one is just the engineering question that, like, okay, but like, how would this actually work exactly? And I think that there is a really unhelpful strand of classical Marxism that basically says, don't worry about it. We'll figure all that out, when we come to it. And it does seem like, if nothing else, I mean, one of the lessons you should really take from the kind of, flawed socialist experiments of the 20th century is, the idea that, like, the dialectic of history will sort of take care of all that, right? That when people are there, they'll figure it out. It'll be presumptuous to try to advance. It's like, I think that did, I think at this point, clearly not, right? I mean, this is like when you're actually in a position of having to, plan an economy, it's you run into all of these problems. And so I think a lot of what you're talking about, Jason, is like, yeah, it's not just, I mean, look, I mean, clearly there is more truth than none to that idea that we're a nation of temporarily embarrassed millionaires. I mean, you've met, I know you've met plenty of people who are, whose crypto investments slash screenplays slash, are going to pay off any day now, right? That's that the world's full of those people, but also, but also even outside of that, or even outside of people who are just sort of, billionaire simps, right? Which definitely also exist. I think what you're talking about is this entirely rational fear of making a leap into the unknown, especially when we have so much evidence, right, for the history of the 20th century that can go very wrong. And so, this is why, Marx, probably one of the least helpful sentences he ever wrote is, in a preface to Capital, where he sort of rolls his eyes at the idea of writing recipes for the cookshops of the future. That, that's what, it's like, oh, that's what you want me to have done in Capital. And, I think at a certain point, if you're going to get people on board with, radical systemic change, which we all want to, you do have to write some recipes for the cookshops of the future, if only to, convince people that they'll have something to eat in the future.
Yeah, or at least tell us what ingredients are going to go into the dish, right? So I know what dish it is that we're trying to get. I would actually, I think everything that Ben said is right. I'm going to kind of break this down into 3 reasons. I'm going to go for the ones that I'm more sympathetic with to less sympathetic with. To Ben's point, I think that a lot of people, certainly a lot of socialists, don't acknowledge the very serious risks that people assume when they try to push for improvements in their material conditions. And I don't need to tell any fans of the show this, right? Trying to unionize in the United States carries with it an enormous amount of risk. Joining a radical political movement carries with it a considerable amount of risk, especially today if you're a migrant, which many people are. You're from a migrant family, right? And I think that all of that has been understated because of this presumption that the working class has nothing to lose but its chains, and consequently, why not engage in radical agitation? Well, people have quite a bit that they can be concerned to lose, and I have a lot of sympathy for that. The second reason I think that a lot of people don't necessarily stand up for their interests the way they should is also what Ben was getting at, right? This idea that all of us, or many of us, think of ourselves as temporarily embarrassed millionaires. I remember Roger Ebert wrote a review of Martin Scorsese's Casino, which I really liked. And he said, casinos run on the optimism principle, the idea that many people, certainly in the United States, fundamentally see themselves as the hero of their own story. So, of course, they're eventually going to get that big blowout because how could the hero of the story not have a happy ending, right? And you see that all the time, the kind of people with their crypto investments, like Ben said, that dude who's always sitting on a screenplay that's going to sell for $1 million and go on to win 8 Oscars, right? If you have that kind of mindset, it's hard to start thinking in social terms about how you might need to better your situation by engaging with others. But then I think the last point that we've always understated is the extent to which some people are just extremely comfortable with hierarchy and domination, even if they are subordinated. And I think this is something that conservatives have grasped a lot better than the left for a long time. I'll just give 2 examples at different poles, right? Joseph de Maistre, the great French reactionary to the French Revolution, once said monarchy actually elevates people more than democracy. So people will like monarchy better than democracy because monarchy is exciting. It's glamorous. There's power associated with it. Whereas democracy for a lot of people is just you go cast a ballot. Your vote doesn't actually matter. And since ordinary people are the ones who are having a say in things, most of what they're going to be voting on are things like improving the sewer system, right? Nothing that's galvanizing and exciting. And Donald Trump said pretty much exactly the same thing in The Art of the Deal through his ghostwriter a couple of centuries later, where he said, look, most people don't like to think very big. They think small about the world. Nevertheless, people get very excited by those who do think big, and they're willing to follow them and do what they're told, basically, right? And this is why he argued for what he called truthful hyperbole, kind of innocent form of exaggeration to excite people. Or if you want the more technical term, they call it bullshit, premium bullshit, but still bullshit, right? But what Trump is latching on here is that for a lot of people, even if they don't aspire to be Mr. Burns, they're quite happy being Waylon Smithers, right? Just falling around in the wake of rich people, brown-nosing for them all day long, as long as they get a taste of the kind of power and affluence that these people have to offer. And I think if you look at a lot of Trump supporters, that's kind of what they're getting at, right? They like the kind of luxury, the power, the machismo that he's associated with. And if they can't possess it themselves, they figure that if they support him, some of that will rub off on them. And it's a very, very powerful, very ubiquitous sentiment.
I like that. I like that. I do think there's just a lot more people that want to buy a house than want to be a millionaire. And I think the millionaire conflation gets a little overstated, because if you actually were to hang out and talk to more regular people that have crypto investments, that maybe work multiple jobs, what they really want is to buy a home. And the conditions to buy a home 60 years ago was just get a job at a factory.
Yeah.
Right.
I always tell my friends or my students, even when they ask me, like, where do you live? Like in my apartment, they're like, don't you want to get a house? I'm like, fuck, guys, the only house I'm ever going to own, the only property I'm ever going to own is my coffin when I'm buried in it. Even then, I'm probably going to have to, save up a little bit of money to pay it in installments, right? I'll tell Marion if I die first, right? Work a little bit and we'll pay off that coffin, because I would like to rest there without having my remains.
Ben and I have a friend that just bought her coffin not too long ago, because that's the one thing that person can buy.
There you go. Right.
They can't afford a house, but they can afford a coffin. That's a sad state of affairs.
Yeah, absolutely. Right?
Yeah,
and look, a lot of people
coffin debt must be a thing, right? Like
that's a thing.
Yeah,
that's a thing.
Just fucking 70 years old. It's like, look, I'm sorry, I had to take a second job, so I'm working at the grocery store, and then I'm also working part-time doing some landscaping, because I got to make sure I can't saddle my family with my coffin debt, right? It's just going to be too much.
That's the sad reality of where we are in the United States with capitalism, that you're the one thing that you can afford is the box that you're buried in, especially if you don't want any of the death accoutrements, which I always thought were the most disgusting.
Don't worry, the Republicans will take that away soon, right? They're going to sit there and be like, all these greedy dead people just expecting handouts and plots of land all over the place, right? If they really wanted to be buried somewhere safe, they should have gotten a job in life.
Damn.
Yeah, if you be like, we'll just do Soylent Green, but it'll be open what it's made of, right? There'll be no secret about it. Right, and be like, look, if you didn't want to be made into Soylent Green when you died, we're not killing anybody for it, right? If when you died, if you didn't want to be made of Soylent Green, you should have saved up for that plot of that plot in the graveyard, right? I mean, we told you, we gave you a chance, so nobody can complain about this.
I also want to ask you guys before we move on. This book originally was supposed to be published last year. So there's certain things you guys don't talk about in the book, and you make that known in the introduction. Did Mike Watson write the introduction?
Daniel thought
he wrote the foreword. He wrote the intro too.
Oh, I'd have to check actually. So
I have to check. I know I wrote some stuff, then Daniel wrote some stuff. But in terms of the trajectory of this book, I actually thought it was going to come out all the way back in 2023.
It was 2 years ago. Yeah, I know it was a few years ago. So there's things you guys don't talk about. You don't talk about Israel, Palestine. Maybe it didn't even happen when you guys were writing the book. And you do make that known in the introduction, which I think is important. But you had to find another publisher for the book because of one of the writers in question. Does this kind of play into what you were talking about with morality?
Yeah, I mean, well, what ended up happening, just the brief version, is we had originally signed with a small indie press, Punctum, right? That's famous for publishing kind of radical culture war interventions. And I was reasonably happy with that, but I did think that they were taking quite a long time, right? We had handed in the book around, I think, 2023, and then, 2024 was coming. And eventually got an email telling us.
Yeah, very early 2023, I think it was all handed in. And it wasn't, somehow it took so long after that it was gonna be like, we thought it was gonna come out like in November 2024, right? That's when it was supposed to.
Yeah, and I got a feeling after that something was going on, right? It's like when you're going on that date with a girl and you go on one or two dates and then you start texting her and she doesn't get back to you for like a day or two. When you do that to her, right? You start to get a feeling that there's not a lot of enthusiasm here for this, right? Because we're not moving hard on it. But eventually we got an email from them saying that they were unhappy with the fact that Ben had published in Quillette and had gone on Joe Rogan because there's nothing less left than trying to promote socialism to millions of people.
Yeah.
And then they were angry at me for also writing for Quillette and writing for Compact Magazine, which some people might know as Sword Magazines before I moved on to Unheard. It's kind of a weird little publisher that publishes some left people, some right people, and then some, let's just call it eccentricities, right?
I like that. Okay.
Yeah, well, I mean, Compact is a weird magazine, and I don't even mean that necessarily as a dig. I think it's kind of distinctive that way, and I don't deny that there are a lot of people who publish in it that I don't agree with at all, right? But my kind of philosophy is always, if you want to go fishing, then you don't want to go fishing in a barrel, and you also don't want to go fishing in a desert, right? You go fishing where there are wild fish that you can catch, right? So just publishing in socialist magazines isn't really going to do that much. Publishing where people aren't going to listen to you at all, that's not going to do very much. Compact, I thought, was, well, there's people who are at least socialism curious here, so it's worth reaching out.
Socialism curious.
Yeah, but I mean, this is the thing, right? Like, I think actually that's Ben's term that I probably just stole. But they weren't happy with it, so they dropped us. And I actually thought that was going to be the end of the project. But then Rovol Press came in and kind of picked it up and saved the day, really.
Well, shout out to Mike Watson.
Yeah, 100%. Shout out, Mike.
Now, in your piece, you lay out 3 big moral claims you think Marx was making, especially about self-determination and collective agency. Could you unpack those a bit for us and explain why they matter right now? You write, for instance, that Marx doesn't just focus on what comes after capitalism, but on how to get there. And that feels especially relevant in this moment of political stagnation. Sure.
Well, one of the things that I point out, kind of contra Conrad, since he and I had a bit of debate in that, is that there's this longstanding millenarian attitude that you see in left circles that's usually accompanied by enormous disdain for bourgeois society. And it holds essentially that after the revolution, everything is going to be changed, right? We're going to have a whole new society with a whole new value system, if we need a value system at all, new institutions, right? There's not going to be any more Marvel films. Everything is to be changed, right? And whatever it is you say about this, it's most definitely not a Marxist position. From the very beginning, Marx always stressed, of course, that a historical and materialist understanding of change demonstrates that there's going to be a lot of an old society in a new society, because how could there not be, right? It's not like with the advent of capitalism, aristocratic institutions just disappeared, right? If you're from Canada like me, you know that we still have a king, right? Unfortunately, I should add. And, he makes this very express in the critique of the Gotha program, where he actually is critical of people who argue that liberalism is just going to be transcended and abandoned after the revolution. He says, no, actually, any new society is going to be stamped by features of the old, which means there's probably going to be a lot of institutions, including liberal rights and liberal laws, in the new kind of socialist society that you create. And if you feel otherwise, Marx, who could be quite caustic, suggests that you are a utopian socialist, not a Marxist. So that's important, I think, in trying to appreciate what's going to occur after a kind of radical transformation in society, right? Radical means, of course, from the root. It could very well be that many, many things are changed, but that doesn't mean everything is going to be changed, because if everything was changed, then we're dealing with an entirely different plan. So that's one important thing. The other important thing that I wanted to stress is that fundamentally, Marx does have an account of human flourishing in his work that's maintained pretty consistently from beginning to end. And associated with that, he develops a lot of critical normative terms and ideas that are intended to demonstrate what's inhibiting people from achieving their full flourishing. You can think of things like alienation, exploitation, which is used in a more descriptive sense in Capital Volume 1. But I don't think there's any denying that it has a kind of normative quality to it. And what he stressed throughout is that the free development of the individual is something that needs to be fostered, right? We want individuals to be able to express their individuality, but that can only be achieved in a social context where other people help facilitate our powers. And I think this is a very attractive ideal. Indeed, it's an ideal that has ancient roots going all the way back to Aristotle, who Marx was very influenced by. And what it essentially holds is, look, you cannot fully express your individuality without others, which might seem paradoxical. But I think Amartya Sen gave a nice example of this, right? Imagine you were on a desert island. You know, if you ever saw the movie Castaway, and there was no one else around you. There was no one who was inhibiting your liberty. You could do whatever you want on this desert island, but you were completely alone, right? Well, very few of us would see that as a satisfactory life, let alone a free life. We probably see that desert island like a prison. And the reason is, of course, that we can only be truly free and truly flourish in a social setting, hopefully, according to Marx, at least one characterized by a lack of exploitation, domination, and alienation.
Matt, one thing that you do is you contrast your view with Althusser. You write, even in the era of the great European communist parties, even if the era of the great European communist parties has passed, Althusser still seems to play the role of a kind of inverse superego for the Marxist left, condemning any hint of moralism. Can you talk about the tension between humanism and anti-humanism within Marxist traditions, and maybe give your thoughts on what's at stake in reviving humanism today?
Sure. Well, I want to make clear that I am not opposed to theorizing on the philosophy of history, let alone theorizing about the operations of hegemony and power in the market economy, right? My kind of dictum is always from each socialist critic according to his or her ability, to each according to the kind of quality of their analysis. And if you can make a solid case for why it is we need to be critical or why we need to examine a given form of domination, I think that's just as valuable as making normative arguments, right? Or if you make bad arguments for how power operates, that's just as bad, I should say, as making poor moral arguments. But I think that for a long time, certainly post Engels and his pamphlets on utopian and scientific socialism, there was this kind of very vulgar Marxism that emerged that held that any kind of moral argumentation that you made for socialism smacked of being ahistorical, unscientific, even, a little bit soft, I think was the attitude, right? There was this kind of manly expectation that real socialists just analyze power, just analyze economics. They don't engage in any of that kind of highly subjective, moralistic crap. And I just think that this is a prejudice that doesn't really have a lot sustaining it other than attitude, right? Like I mentioned before, scratched very thin beneath the surface. And it was always very clear that the so-called hard-edged socialists that were just analyzing power or just analyzing economics baked an enormous number of normative assumptions that they just never bothered to argue for very cogently into their analysis. Again, the two that I always mention is this expectation that having a freer society would be better than a less free society, and having a more equal society would be better than having a less equal society, right? Now, again, I want to reemphasize, I do think having a freer and more equal society is a good thing. But many, many people do not agree, right? Certainly many people in Trump world today don't agree that a freer and more equal society is a good thing. So we need to make the case explicitly. And I think that a failure to be overt about that is misleading.
Ben?
Yeah, no, I think,
I'm fucking with you. I knew you didn't have anything. Ben, your chapter is called Analytical Marxism, Marxism, and the Future of Scientific Socialism. Say that 5 times fast. You're writing about a tradition that's often misunderstood or dismissed outright, analytical Marxism. So let me throw it to you plainly. What is analytical Marxism, and why do you think it still has something valuable to offer the left? You write, all analytical Marxism thinkers reject the idea that Marxism has its own distinctive method. Instead, they deploy intellectual techniques shaped within non-Marxist Western social science and philosophy. So what does that look like in practice?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to be really, polemical about this and probably take it, much too far, I could say that analytical Marxism is Marxism without the bullshit, which is actually was the title of the original title for another collection that Matt and I were doing. It was going to be called No Bullshit Socialism, and the the publisher didn't like that, so we're not going to do that. But
I still stand on that being a better title than what we wound up with.
Yeah, it happens. But yeah, no, I think that the less polemical way to say it is the way that what you just read out from the essay. So this is basically the division here is, do you think that Marx or Marxists have a distinctive way of figuring out what the truth is about how society works or how history works or any of the questions they're interested in, or do you basically think that no, I mean, there's no special Marxist way of figuring things out, that Marxism is not a distinctive method, it's a distinctive set of conclusions, and analytical Marxism is basically the second one, and so lots of so what that's contrasted to is the view that dialectical analysis is this special way of investigating the world and figuring things out, and I think that oftentimes that can really be a cover. I mean, I think that when people talk about that, I think that the things, some of the things they're talking about can involve real insights, but I think that those insights become more clear when you kind of translate it out of the Hegelese into the sort of ordinary language of causes, effects, mechanisms. And so as far as what that looks like in practice, I would just point to, certainly the work of the Marxist thinker that I am talking about, in that essay, who's the late G.A. Cohen, and I'm kind of using him as a springboard for thinking about, thinking about how this works, what it can look like, and I talk about a few different a few different things that can involve, right? So some of it can just be about kind of clarifying Marxist arguments by breaking down, okay, what exactly are the the premises here? Why is the conclusion supposed to follow? What's the evidence for this? And another thing, though, that can involve, sorry, I'm going to turn off the camera because it looks like I froze there. And then of course, I mean, if you're going to treat, Marx like any other historical thinker, you look at the arguments, you see which ones make sense, and you go with those, and, anything that doesn't, you jettison, then that can mean, of course, the dreaded sin of revisionism, which Tony's comment was kind of getting at with the thing about the labor theory of value, in that example, that that you should just sort of be very willing to throw things out when they don't make sense, and then another add another layer is what we talked about earlier. What you're asking Matt about earlier, about making explicitly moral arguments, and this is also something that analytical Marxist thinkers like Cohen, do a lot of, is sort of bringing out what's the sort of implicit normative commitments here, and kind of reasoning about them, and seeing what makes sense there, and all that. And so I give examples of all of these things in the essay, and I should also say that this is, I've written a lot about Cohen's work in various places, and Jacobin, and Substack, but this is also by far the most, the most critical that I've been of Cohen's work and anything that I've written, right? Because the sort of first 3/4 of the essay praise a lot of things that he's right about, but the last chunk does get into like some real disagreements with some of his later work.
You say that Cohen reframes. Oh, I'm sorry, Matt. Were you going to say something?
No, I wanted to add. I think I'm definitely a little bit more sympathetic to the kind of continentally inflected versions of Marxism, and let's just say critical theory, than Ben is. Because I think they have real insights about the nature of power and ideology, all those kinds of things. Not just people like Althusser, but for that matter, also people contemporarily like Zizek, or Wendy Brown. But what I really find attractive about analytical Marxism, and Ben is getting at this, it's just a very simple thing. It's this kind of clarity of exposition, or clarity of prose, right? Making your ideas obvious so that people can assess them and criticize them. But beyond just, I think, serving a useful intellectual function, because I think we should be able to clearly assess and evaluate arguments, right? Rather than having to kind of muddle through whether someone actually means this or that or whatever it happens to be. I think this is politically valuable, right? I think that by making a lot of theory extremely opaque and difficult for people to understand, then we've also made it harder for activists, working class people who have 2 or 3 jobs to actually make use of some of these ideas. And I think what analytical Marxism does more effectively is bring things down to earth in terms of how these ideas are expressed, so that we can be taken up by others more easily.
Yeah, and I think that this is look. I mean, I'm not. I the sort of jokey exaggeration at the beginning about bullshit notwithstanding. I mean, look, I don't. I certainly don't deny that there are real insights to be gained from thinkers who are not at all in this tradition. I mean, you mentioned Zizek. He's been on my show like 20 times, right? I love the guy. So I think that oftentimes, yeah, I mean, I think these people are worth reading, and even when it feels kind of like panning for gold, sort of finding the nuggets of insight in what they're saying. But as far as my preferred mode of doing theory, right, I like, my preference is for doing it in this very analytical way, for all the reasons you were just saying. And I would add just kind of that it's sort of much more democratic in a certain way, right? That like you're like having, so tying into your point about accessibility, right? That this is that when you're sort of treating this in this way, like, I don't know. So, sorry, I'm still thinking about that Tony comment about value, and this certainly wouldn't apply to our friend Tony, but I mean, I think like a lot of people like who are sort of very continentally kind of Marxist, who will make a big deal about talking about the value form or whatever. Like, it is like really like trying to nail down in a sentence like literally what they mean by that, right? Like it's like, like find, value is fill out the rest of the sentence, right? Can be very difficult, right? Like, so if you
lay that out in your essay, though.
Yeah. No, I do talk about this a bit in the essay, but yeah, I think that, I think that, yeah, but like a lot of people, like if you're, I mean, I don't know, Michael Heinrich, Moshe Pistone, right? People like this, like who are really into the value theory stuff, would say that, what I talk about in the essay doesn't really touch, what they're talking about, but then like, it's very hard to nail down exactly what they're talking about. And same, and then especially when you say, oh, well, I'm having, if you're just kind of making straightforward arguments where you're appealing to, to what, to empirical evidence and thinking about whether things make sense and all of that, you're sort of missing the profundities of the, dialectical, analysis of the, unfolding contradictions in the totality or whatever. It's like the effect of all this in practice is to make Marxism some, a bit like medieval Catholicism, that you don't, that the ordinary parishioners, literally can't even read the language that it's, that the, scripture is presented in, right? You just have to go to the priest for that, right? It's just, in this case, the priests are like academics.
Yeah, I would even go further. I mean, look, I think there are some circumstances where insights are going to be difficult to articulate, in a familiar language, right? Theodore Adorno, who I'm quite fond of, used to say, look, we're trying to fundamentally challenge common sense, by which he meant, common sense hegemony here. And that means invariably we're going to have to use terminology and ideas that are contrary to immediate common sense at the very least. And I think that's all well and good, right? Even read the texts of Marx, right? Some of them are extremely lucid and extremely easy to unpack. But there are also a couple of chapters in Capital, particularly the first 4, that are tough nuts, right? And well, they should be, right? He's dealing with some dense theoretical material here. But to your point, Ben, I think that one should always aim to be as approachable and as clear as possible, both for strategic reasons, because I think it's useful for people to be able to pick up ideas and use them, and for normative reasons, because I think that kind of situates your work in a more democratic framework where people are able to access it and offer commentary on it in whatever way they think is appropriate. But I go beyond that and also say, I think that you made a point in your book, Canceling Comedians When the World Burns, which speaks to this, which is that certainly since the 1980s, a lot of people who identify with Marxism, with critical theory, have been academics, artists, people who exist in countercultural spaces. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, right? I mean, obviously, I'm an academic, and I think there's useful things that we do. But I think one consequence of this is we've tended to prioritize forms of exposition that are the kind of things that academics like. We want our writing to be dense and difficult and hard to go through because aesthetically, that's just taken as a sign that you're profound or deep. Or we want it to be provocative, poetic, exciting, right? Without necessarily being clear or political, because again, that's the kind of thing that aesthetically tends to jive in those communities. And I think too much of that has really been a disaster, certainly for the intellectual left, because it means that we've prioritized the kind of aesthetic and literary values that are appropriate for people who want to make it in a literary journal, rather than what's appropriate for, a political movement that's supposed to be reaching the least well off.
Yeah, and and again, I mean, just to kind of circle back to the beginning of this chunk, right? I mean, this is like, I think that even if it would be unfair to dismiss all Marxist theory done in other modes as as just sort of silly bullshit or whatever, I certainly would not and do not do that. But like, there's a fair amount of silly bullshit. Let's be real about that, right? Like that's like it doesn't. There's no shortage of that. I mean, like I think so. This is not even a Marxist example. Like I always think of when I was an undergrad, the last philosophy class that I took in my undergrad institution was it was like a capstone class for seniors, and it was like run like a grad student, where like a grad seminar where everybody would like take turns, you'd like with some student would be assigned to like present right on the reading that we're doing for that week. And when it was my turn to do that, the thing that I was supposed to present on was Jacques Derrida's The Gift of Death. And
I have that over there. Yeah.
Okay, well, maybe you got more out of it than I did, but I read it and I don't know what I just read.
Yeah.
And it's like, I literally don't know what this means.
Yeah.
So I just made something up. I mean, I was kind of riffing on the title, right? As much as anything else. I was really just entirely pulling it out of my ass because I just had no idea. And I kept expecting to be called on it, right? Like that somebody would be like, Ben, what are you talking about? Did you not read this? And I've got to say that was pretty formative for me when nobody did, right? That's like, oh, wait a second.
Did a light bulb go off in your head?
Like this is the Emperor's New Clothes right now, right? And so I would just say that that's like shaped a lot of my subsequent interests, and it certainly shaped how I try to do this stuff, because I think we should aspire to do this stuff in a way where if you didn't understand it, that would be immediately obvious to everybody because everybody else did understand it.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. I actually had a similar experience. I at the conference where I met my wife, right? So we were in London. I was actually able to go to this because we'd gone on strike and we'd won, and when I got a bunch of back pay. So I was like, critical theory summer school in London, great way to kind of boost up my resume. But anyway, there was a lecture on Deleuze and Hegel, which sounds like paradise for Ben, I know, but you'll have to never regret that you weren't there. And anyway, so I was having a debate with people afterwards, after a couple beers, let's just put it that way. And what I realized is if I wanted to win every debate, I just said that however radical the interpretation people thought was being given, I need to push it in even more radical direction, right? So if somebody said like what they're talking about is the way that we understand reality, I would always go further and be like, no, what he was talking about wasn't just how we understand reality. That's the more radical gestures realize that this lack of understanding is built into the structure of reality itself, right? Reality itself is not a kind of complete system. And I just completely made this up, right? I have no idea whether that was true or not. But everybody was like, yeah, you know what? That sounds really quite plausible, right? And the reason had nothing to do with the kind of arguments being put forward, but the affectation, right? Everybody wanted to kind of move in what seemed like the most aesthetically radical and the most exciting kind of interpretation, whether or not it was kind of plausible, right? So I don't think that intellectual work should be carried out that way under any kind of circumstances, right? Sometimes the most anti-Foucault arguments, I like Foucault. But I think, by and large, you should try to make claims that people can evaluate based upon their merits. If you can make them sound pleasing from a literary standpoint or have some good writing, then that's a bonus, right? But we should err on the side of being more transparent and more explicit rather than less, I think.
I mean, there's so Eric Olin Wright, who is a friend of J. Cohen, and they were part of something called the September Group, which was a group of analytical Marxist academics who'd meet once a year in September and hotel rooms and read over and trash each other's papers and whatnot. But he has in his book Classes, he has this quote at the beginning from his mom, actually, Be It Right, which I've always liked, at least since I read it, which is that you should always, you should try to write in such a way that it'll make it very easy for people to know why they disagree with you, right? Like that's like which is just, I don't know. I think there's a real virtue there that you have, that I know that if you are, a certain kind of personality type who, I mean, obviously there are pros and cons to different approaches, right? I think analytic philosophy at its worst, ends up being, spending a lot of time on minutia that's not really
I would go further, Ben, and say that analytic philosophy at its worst can be boring as fuck. I mean, if I'm sitting there having a big argument with you about whether or not the cow, the cow frame that's in front of another cow, is actually the cow, because if I point to it and say there is a cow there, even if I'm pointing at the frame because there is actually a cow behind it, I'm describing the accurate state of affairs, right? I took a class on philosophy of language where we debated that for about an hour and a half, and at the end of it, I was ready to just fucking either shoot myself or sit there and expropriate the class, to put it to better purposes as I understood it, right?
Yeah, right. So I think the pitfall of analytic philosophy is you end up spending a lot of time arguing about things that don't really matter or aren't really that interesting. That sort of the really rigorously getting to the bottom of it becomes the point, and you don't always pause to consider whether it's worth rigorously getting to the bottom of whatever you're talking about. And there could be a kind of science envy that people sort of want to imitate the way that in the hard sciences you do people will do these very small, very narrow findings, but it all kind of adds up to something, and it's not really clear that it does add up to something in philosophy. No. So I think that's all true, right? But I think that the real danger on the other side is that the kind of people for whom reading the Hegel and Deleuze seminar, right, is really appealing. A lot of what people get out of that is this sort of intellectual challenge of reading the really dense book and figuring out what it what the author is saying, and feeling like they get the view, and that and that really is like that's like that sort of Emperor's New Clothes effect is a huge danger of that, right? Because it's like it's if you have to put all this investment to even like figuring out what people are saying, right, then like I think that on the flip side, right, you want it to have been worth all that effort, right? So like so you want to convince yourself, right, that there's some like deep insight here, even when there's not, right? That they
I call it the Jordan Peterson phenomena.
Yeah, it's like it's like Scientology, right? I mean, like once you get to OT10 and you find out about the aliens, right? You don't want to think you've just wasted, all that time and money, getting up there, right?
What's that Community episode where the dean is making the infomercial and Annie kind of gets crazy and she's like, the dean is a genius, because if he's not a genius, then that means I've wasted the last couple of weeks of my life.
Exactly.
And ergo, that's not acceptable. So he must be a genius, right? It's like, yeah, we've all been there, right? Where we realize, like, man, did I just fucking waste an awful lot of my time on stuff that was a whole bunch of bullshit? That's not great on me.
That was the realization I had when I lost everything in my late 20s. When the market crashed. Now, Ben, you also talk about moralism, and I want to bring this up because it connects back to something Matt said earlier. You defend a kind of good moralism in Marxism, but criticize what you call bad moralism, especially in the context of online culture and cancel culture. Can you break that down for us? What's the difference? Sure. And how do we avoid the pitfalls of the left becoming a scene of performance and moral posturing? I mean, hell, you could talk about why this book got pulled from the original publisher.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, look, the basic distinction I would make here, I mean, there are people who, so that word moralism can be used to mean a couple different things, right? So sometimes it's just used to mean like talking about morality, right? Like Enzo Rossi, that's an example of like a Marxist who uses the word moralism that way a lot, right? That just sort of any kind of time you're making explicitly moral claims and moral arguments, right? Like Enzo would call that moralism. And if that's what you mean by moralism, then I think that that moralism is good, actually, right? Because I mean, basically the argument that I made before, that we all have judgments about what's good or bad, right or wrong, just or unjust, and really the only question is whether we're going to be guided by those judgments without ever pausing to think about them, or whether we're going to go for some self-awareness and reflection and like try to break down exactly what you think, why you think it, if you have a good argument for it, all that stuff. And obviously I'm on team self-awareness and reflection there. I think that it is good to be aware of what moral judgments you're making and to reason about whether those judgments make sense. But the way I would use the word moralism, if I'm using it as a pejorative, is not that, right? It's not the Enzo Rossi sort of meaning. It's this kind of excessive focus on individual moral virtue, right? Which is a very different thing, right, from what Marxism is traditionally interested in, or even like what the sort of more the sort of most intellectually robust forms of liberalism are interested in, right? Like John Rawls, whatever, stuff like that, which is thinking about the justice or injustice of social structures, right? That's a very different thing from sort of obsessing about the individual moral virtue of particular people. And basically, I mean, going back to the book that Matt mentioned earlier, Canceling Comedians While the World Burns: Critique of the Contemporary Left, which came out a few years ago. And certainly if I were somehow in a position to do a second edition or whatever, which I don't think I could anyway, because the people who took over Zero Books I think probably wouldn't be interested in it, But if I did, obviously there's lots that changed because it's been a very long 4 years since that book came out, and a lot has happened, that would change all sorts of things that I said.
What's happened since then?
Oh, I'll fill you in later. But I think the core argument of the book still seems right to me, which is about what I called there the pathologies of powerlessness. That I think that because of the historic defeats of the left, and particularly in American context, how marginal it's really always been here, but I mean certainly more so for the last several decades. Then I think that leads people. I think that leads towards this counterproductive focus on individual moralism that I as our friend Conan said, right, if you can't have justice, right, you'll settle for catharsis, right, and I see that all the time, right, that people want to show. It's like, look, if you can't win, you can at least be the best, purest, martyr, for the truth. And and I think I think that this manifests in a lot of ways on the left and in the culture of the left, that because if you're interested, like if you think you can win, then almost by definition, right, I mean your goal is to get as many people on your side as all possible. Right. I mean, that's how, you would win any sort of, I mean, anything from a union organizing drive to like a, global socialist revolution and anything in between. Right. That's how you do it. Whereas if you don't really believe that you could win, like, even if you say you do, right, you really don't, and all you're really trying to do is just sort of register the depths of your opposition to what's going on around you in the world, that you're this sort of like, look, I'm a good person, so I'm opposed to all of this stuff, and you want to you kind of want to put that on the record, right, that how opposed you all are. Then suddenly the incentives are very different, right? I mean, it doesn't, like, why, instead of trying to get a bunch of people on your side who might be flawed in various ways, and to try to, to get them in the tent and try to see, okay, what are the things, even if we don't agree on everything, what's what are the things we do agree with, and, we'll work on that. And maybe I'm going to try to convince you about the other stuff later. I think you suddenly, it makes sense to say, oh, wait a second, here I am, doing my pure moral protest, and you're standing beside me, like you also have a soul that's as good as mine is, right? But like, I think you really don't, right? I've seen your old tweets, right? And you get a lot of the stuff that we've, a lot of the stuff that we see an awful lot of on the American left, I think really comes out of that mindset.
Yeah, I mean, the way that I always distinguish between morality and moralism is actually going back to my own experiences, right? So I grew up Roman Catholic, and small town Canada, not really the most interesting place, and there are and there are many people who every day on Sunday, they come and they'd make sure that they wear their best outfits. They'd always make a big show about talking about how, we need to be sexually pure, how we need to avoid, smut in the schools. But then you talk to them about, well, what about all that stuff Jesus says about it being easier for a rich man to, harder for a rich man to get into the kingdom of heaven than for a camel to pass through the eye of the needle, or how we need to give everything that we own to the poor. They'd be like, well, that's meant to be metaphorical, right? Now, excuse me, I need to go and golf, right? Because it's Sunday. And what that really demonstrates is a concern with the forms of justice rather than the substance of it, to quote Cormac McCarthy from All the Pretty Horses, right? And I think that you see this routinely all the time in the left in many of the ways that Ben was describing. The only thing that I would add to this is that this really can align itself with this conviction that we are perennially going to lose, so that the best thing that we can do is to criticize and to call out and to suggest where people aren't good-souled enough, rather than involving ourselves in any of the difficult decisions that are involved by a movement, or involved in a movement that actually thinks it's going to take power. Just to give an example, this week, or I guess last week, really, I saw somebody calling out Zoran Mondani, of all things, right? Saying, I'm very sure that Zoran Mondani is just going to end up being like AOC, just another shill for the Democratic Party. Inevitably, somebody threw up that ContraPost meme where she's sitting there. It's like, these people don't want to wield power. What they want to do is endlessly critique power. There's a big difference, right? Well, to me, this kind of continuous anxiety about whether left figures, even successful ones, are going to let us down, and not being able to think through productively how we should carry forward the momentum of a victory is all indicatory of this facile concern for the forms of justice rather than its substance, because somebody who did actually care that much about trying to make the world a better place would say, okay, we've won a big victory. That's good. Now, how do we build upon it? Not, well, this just still isn't good enough, so we shouldn't even be bothering to celebrate it.
Yeah, right. I mean, this is that they like, what's the concern that like, oh, he's gonna become like AOC. I mean, it's like, I think there are like specific criticisms you can make of AOC that
Sure.
that I think are valid, but like I think that but like it seems like what people are saying when they say stuff like that is like, oh, that this person is going to be like compromised by engaging in politics, right? And it's like, well, okay. I mean, don't you want that though? Right? I mean, like if I mean, what I would hope for is that Zoran Mamdani becomes mayor in the fall, and that he's that he actually gets some stuff done, right? That like some of those agenda items that he's been running on, that he actually manages to implement some version of them, which would which would inevitably involve all sorts of compromise and trade-offs that are often quite messy, because if you're going to do something like run the municipal government of one of the biggest cities in the world, right? I mean, like there's no you don't you can't just sort of get up there and proclaim I don't know, read out passages from the Little Red Book and have have everybody do what you say, right? I mean, you have to engage with all kinds of different interest groups and and make political compromises and all that, and that's what I want to happen, right? That's what I hope to happen, right? But I think a lot of people don't, right? I mean, I saw somebody who's actually a member of the National Political Committee of DSA, which depresses the shit out of me, who Nick French had written an article in Jacobin about Zoran's approach to public safety, and what he said about how he wants to create this other unarmed department of public safety or community, something, I don't remember what he would call it, that would do certain tasks that the police force currently does, but he doesn't want to defund the NYPD. He just wants to free up the existing police resources to focus on violent crime. And Nick wrote an article sort of praising this as like a approach that makes more sense than a lot of the kind of maximalist stuff that people on the left sometimes say about policing.
Mm-hmm.
And whatever you think about the details of that, I mean, honestly, my biggest concern is the same one it's always been about this stuff, which is I just don't know how much you'd have to pay social workers to get them to take these jobs, right? But like whatever you think about all this, this person's on the National Political Committee of DSA, quote tweeted that article and said, Jacko bin, right? Jack bin, with the KKK, because the article was saying that we shouldn't abolish the police, I guess. And it's like, yes, somebody who says things like that, it's like, what are they Like there's nothing you could possibly do as the mayor of a major city that would make somebody like that happy. Like there's no scenario where where you actually govern New York in a way that would satisfy the demands of that person.
Yeah, I'd go even further and say, I think Irving Howe is right when he points out that whether they acknowledge it or not, the influence of Puritanism on American socialism is far more pronounced than many people are willing to acknowledge, right? Much like the influence of Puritanism is kind of transparent across American culture. I think a lot of people adopt this hagiographic understanding of what they themselves are aspiring to and what socialism should aspire to, where all problems are going to be solved, no compromises are required, and the best agenda is implemented, so we end up with the best of all possible worlds. And I think to Ben's point, as long as you continuously think, I'm never going to be required to implement this in any realistic way, it's very easy to hold on to those views and then even to tell yourself kind of self-flatteringly, well, the reason why it is I'm never going to get everything that I want is because I'm just too good, right? I'm too good for this world. My vision is too good for this world. If only we could live up to that, right? Whereas, when you get involved in the messy realm of actual everyday politics, sometimes you do have to make compromises and concessions and examine the real world of what's possible at any given time. Now, that doesn't mean that we should lower our standards in any kind of substantial way. I think we just need to be realistic, right? Or as Gramsci would say, adopt an optimism of the will and pessimism of the intellect. But all that said, right, if Zoran fucking Mandani is not a left-wing enough mayor for you, then I'm not even going to say that you should leave the United States for another country. I'd say it's about time to go set up one of those colonies on Mars, because you're just never going to be satisfied with what any actual existing socialist, no matter how committed, is going to be able to achieve.
I mean, I'm with you on that. It's fascinating to see people. I think another problem is the influence that a 24/7 media landscape has
Good point, yeah.
on people, where I don't have to make political concessions with anyone, and I can say whatever I want to say. And that, for me, is the real demarcating line between Malcolm X and MLK. MLK actually was getting legislation passed. Malcolm X got nothing passed because that wasn't his job. He was just a guy that said speeches. He could throw Molotovs into a room. I mean, it came back to get him personally, but as far as politically, no, he wasn't fighting for any legislation. And granted, he died quite young. We don't know what he would have done as he was getting older, as he was making a bit of a pivot. Maybe he does try to really hitch his wagon to the civil rights movement, but he stood outside of it for quite some time. And I'm standing outside of politics right now, so I can call Zoran all the names in the book. Doesn't mean anything.
I also think that, and this is partly to my point about it being problematic that so much of leftist politics is focused on things like aesthetics and aesthetic culture, because it means that a lot of people fail to appreciate that a ton of politics, if you get into power, is extremely boring and often very granular debates about public policy that just don't excite people who are activists. And for that matter, it doesn't really activate people who are theoretically inclined, right? But just to give an example that I brought up on Ben's show the other week, right? The Lula administration lifted tens of millions, if not more, out of poverty through well-tailored socialist programs that are intended to give people a little bit of money when they need it, or give them access to resources that they didn't have before. And that took a lot of trial and error and experimentation to be able to successfully do. But they got it done, right? And it's a real accomplishment, not just for, of course, the Brazilian Workers' Party, but also for the global left, right? Which can then point to that as an example for emulation, right? But that's just not the kind of thing that I think animates a lot of these very online types, to your point, Jason, right? Because it's not exciting. There's a lot of details that are involved. There are always going to be compromises whenever you're trying to make sound policy. But in the end, he made everyone's lives better. And that's what I think socialists should be trying to do. And especially we should be trying to make the lives of the poor and disadvantaged better.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the MLK example is really interesting, right? Because this is, I mean, I think, like, look, certainly in the context of recent American history, I mean, that's by far the most successful left movement, certainly at least the last, like, I don't know, 80, 90 years, right?
Hard to think of anything else that even really compares, right?
Yeah, totally, right. And it is really funny that, like, I think a lot of people are sort of weirdly in denial about some of what made that so effective. That, like, I remember, so when I'm in LA right now, normally over the weekend I'd be in Rosarito, but yeah, I did stay here this weekend, so I could get drunk with friends and watch the fireworks last night, which is why I'm being so slow today. And in the, but, like, while the protests were going on, right, the ICE protests, I mean, not that those have, like, completely ceased or whatever, but, like, while the giant ICE protests were going on in LA, there were all these arguments about optics and stuff. And I actually saw somebody, this is like a, tweet that was making the rounds, so somebody would be like, oh, well, I don't actually think, so they, people bring up the civil rights movement, and so it's like, oh, they didn't, if they'd cared about optics, they would have just stopped or whatever, because, like, everybody hated them, and they like had these polls from the time about how most white people were opposed to the civil rights movement, which is all true, but, like, it seems like the inference is exactly wrong, right? It's like, yeah, they were swimming against the stream of public opinion, which is why they cared a lot about optics. I mean, like, this is a movement that, like, had that had dress codes at protests, right? That had where they'd, like, train people before they did, like, sit-ins at lunch counters not to respond to anybody who, like, came up and insulted you and whatever. And I'm certainly not suggesting that any of these specific things would make sense for the context of 2025, right? But, like, but it does go to the point that if you actually want to get stuff done, right, you have to think a lot, right, about how other people are perceiving what you're doing, and whether what you're doing is sort of feeding into opposition or taking away from it. And I do think I mean, it is kind of funny, right? I mean, I think the Malcolm X comparison is interesting, or, like, I mean, I guess maybe to go to our friend Cedric Johnson, right? The Panthers can't save us, right? The Panther comparison, right? Because there's all this radical mythology that's about the Black Panthers and how amazing they were. It's like, well, they didn't change the world, right? Who did were these lame social democrats in starched suits, and church organizing who in, like, alliance with labor unions and stuff, right? I mean, that's
I appreciated the contribution from the women in the civil rights movement also, I should say, right? A lot of recent scholarship has stressed how if it wasn't for a lot of people who are relegated to secretarial work, but who actually did a lot of the admin and ideological work behind the scene, it's not clear how much would have actually gotten done.
Oh, no doubt. Yeah. But, like, and it's also, I should also say, so obviously all the examples that we've been talking about are, like, reform examples, and knowing, I say this with love, but I know who's in podcast audiences, right? So it's like, if people are thinking it's like, oh, well, that's only applying because you're talking about reformism, but I, sir, am a revolutionary, right? So none of this applies to me. It's like, man, if you had a successful revolution and you took state power, all of this that we're talking about would apply in spades, right? Like, they look at the Bolsheviks, right? So like look at all the messy trade-offs and compromises they had to do, right? I mean, they wouldn't have even won the Russian Civil War if not, if they hadn't managed to, like, get a bunch of Tsarist generals to sign up for the Red Army. And then, like 4 years after the revolution, they had to do the new economic policy and allow in limited forms of private enterprise, so the economy didn't fall apart, right? So it's not even about reform versus revolution. It's just like, if you actually want to wield power, it's never going to be the way it is if you're just talking, right? I mean, this is not a profound insight, but when you're just saying stuff, you can say whatever, right? I mean, if you're actually, say whatever you want.
Yeah.
Right?
My real socialist society is going to have oceans of lemonade, and it's never going to rain, but everybody is going to be well hydrated. And Tupac and Biggie are going to resurrect from the dead and give a joint concert, and that beat is going to be done and buried with, right? All good things will come together, right? I mean, I completely agree with you, and I just want to be clear. Nobody who's advocated for reformism has ever suggested, and I sometimes see this caricature, that you should just take what you can get and then deal with it, right? Eat it, pigs, right? What we're saying is take what you can get when the getting is good and then try to do more afterwards, right?
Exactly.
But if you have an opportunity to make people's lives better or to advance your cause, and you do not take that opportunity because you think, wow, this just isn't quite good enough, then, your mama probably taught you this at some point, right? It's quite probable that opportunity is not going to come again.
Tupac forever, says Del Verde.
Absolutely.
Also, in socialism, Ozzy Osbourne doesn't have his final concert.
Do you think that is really going to be final?
Yes.
I question that too.
Yes.
You do, really?
Yes. If you try to wheel that man out, literally wheel that man out again, you will be wheeling out Weekend at Bernie's.
Yeah.
So this really is some sort of kind of dark, to me, kind of sick. Like, I think a guy like Ozzy Osbourne, and I want to say this about Ozzy Osbourne. Chris Contos came on the show. For those that don't know, Chris Contos is the original drummer in the band Machine Head, and now he's the drummer in Forbidden. He's played in a bunch of other bands, Testament, Death Angel. And Chris is a good buddy. He came on the show a year ago. And Chris said this of Ozzy, and a lot of people don't mention this unless you get a good interview with the band that he's broke. Ozzy was as big as it got when he was in Sabbath. They had a bit of a downward spiral in the late 70s. And then Ozzy has maybe one of the great resurrection stories in the first half of the 80s. And I wrote about this. Can't wait for it to come out. How Ozzy, in my opinion, really does, with Van Halen, lay the groundwork for what people will call hair metal with his first record.
I think that's 100% true.
First two records, right?
Well, as a grunge fan, I should say that that's a mixed legacy.
with Blizzard of Oz and Diary of a Madman, right? Those first two Rose records. But by the time he gets to the Ultimate Sin, and he's a big thing, he's on radio now. MTV has grasped a hold because we're going to see music, we're no longer going to hear it. And Ozzy and his people, you got to give Sharon Osbourne a lot of credit for this, as she really curated that image for him. He's going to be this weird kind of quote unquote Prince of Darkness, but the music really isn't that dark when you listen to it. I always say, listen to the Crazy Train, the scariest intro ever, and then everything is major chords, and it's really great after that. But anyway, Ozzy Osbourne gets to be this stadium solo act with hired guns. So that's just money pouring in from everywhere, because you're paying these guys enough, but they're not millionaires. So what he does is, when he goes on tour with up and coming acts that are pretty small, Metallica is playing clubs, probably getting into small theaters. He lets them have all of their staging.
Really?
Yes. So if you go back and watch footage of Metallica on the Ozzy tour in '86, all those crosses and everything, all their back, they have everything, which is crazy, because anyone that's gone to a concert at an amphitheater or above, you see the opening bands, even main support bands, playing in front of the stage, because the headliner has staging, they have pyro, they have all this stuff. Ozzy moved all that stuff out of the way and said, you guys get your staging. So Metallica could be Metallica. Motley Crue the year before got to be what we now know as Motley Crue, all because Ozzy let those people shine. And that's saying a lot for a headliner. I have literally seen a headliner yell at the opener for being too dynamic.
Ah, fuck it.
I worked at the Great American Music Hall. I will never forget this. This band had opened. They just got a deal, and it was a piano player and a drummer. I can't remember the name of the band. They were really good. The headliner said, "I told you, don't do that fucking showing off." He yelled at dude in the fucking kitchen where I was working, just dressed him down and fired him from the tour.
I remember, I mean, Ozzy seems like a nicer guy from when you said, I watched an interview with him where he's talking about Kiss, of all things. Not a band I'm super fond of, but I've heard they're supposed to be great live. Anyway, he was at like a festival or something where Kiss was right before them.
I think it always helps if you think of Kiss less as a rock band than as a rock-themed circus act.
Yeah, 100%. If that's what you want to go see, I'd be right there with you, right? But anyway, it's like, just sitting there, and then there's these big explosions, and a cannon goes off, and Jeanson comes in looking with devil, and like there's fire and all this stuff, and I'm just like, how the fuck am I supposed to top that? And I was like, I bet Ozzy, if I fucking saw Kiss go in front of me, and they fucking let off a rocket, and we're just breathing fire and all that stuff, I'd probably think like, well, we're fucked now, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I got a big demon or something that's going to come on stage.
I mean, I always think of that. What's that clip of Ozzy in the 80s? I think where he's like, so I mean, to Jason's point about wheeling him out. I mean, this is like 40 years ago, where he's telling the person behind the camera about how he used to do all these drugs and stuff, but now he's clean.
He used to.
Mm-hmm.
Well, as he's pouring orange juice.
Oh, from Decline of Western Civilization Part 2. Yeah. He can't get in the cup,
and he cannot get the orange juice in the cup, right? I mean, like the logistics of like the orange juice jug and the cup, and bringing the two into contact in the right way are just completely beyond him. As he's like, talking about how clean and sober he is now.
I watched the Osbournes. What was the name of that show? The one where you could see it, like you saw their domestic life and shit.
Yeah, the Osbournes.
Yeah, the Osbournes. Anyway, I'll never forget this line. But like Ozzy wakes up and he's all pissed off and hungover. He's like, "Where's me beer? Where's my beer? There's a beer thief in this house." And Sharon's like, "No, Ozzy, you're the beer thief. You drank all your beer last night." He's like, "Really?" He's like, "Yeah, you're the beer thief, Ozzy. You're the beer thief." And I do remember sitting there thinking to myself, like, we've all been there.
He's an interesting character because he let people in a time where rock people were still being mythical gods, right? The Rock of Love, Bret Michaels in his late 40s is still portraying himself as this ladies man that's going to bang a bunch of 25-year-olds, and Ozzy Osbourne lets you see him being kind of this doddering boob that can't speak anymore because of years of hard living. But that being said, he's consistently put together some of the best bands I've ever seen. And anyone that's ever opened for him, he's given them the best shot possible to really shine. And as a person that's been the guy playing first for a much larger act, it means a lot when they give you the stage, when they give you a sound check, when they make sure that you ate, that those are good people that you don't get to meet too much in this business. Even in this podcasting world, there's definitely people that have come along and made sure that, I want to make sure that people know that we dig what you do and you're doing a good thing, and I want more people to watch it, blah, 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 blah. Those are special people. And when they go, the world's a little dimmer. So.
Yeah, no, for
Absolutely,
sure. I mean, look, I mean, pretty much any, and I'll also just say, I mean, just musically, right? I mean, the first, certainly anything from like about the first 5 Ozzy solo records, like, if any of that comes on the radio, I will play the, like wait while the entire song plays, even if I'm parked, right? Like it's, I mean, it gets less memorable after that, but I mean, I think certainly up through, the ultimate sin, or, even even No Rest for the Wicked. I mean, there's this, there's stuff, there's stuff that I really, that I really like there, and, that's the Bloodbath in Paradise, right? That's, that's good stuff. That's on, it's on No Rest for the Wicked, so, and, and I don't know. I did see the guy in concert. It was for the Black Sabbath, like, reunion tour in like 2013. Right, I think they like, I think they had like Everybody But Bill Ward, right? Anyway, they have fair enough, and and I mean, like, even at that point in his life, I mean, the guy's stage presence was awesome. I loved it.
I mean, look,
I mean, some of those legacy acts can be really something, though. Like, I've gone to see Roger Waters twice. Huge Pink Floyd fan when I was growing up, right? And his voice is never really all that impressive, right? But he's performed for fucking 3 hours, right? And I was like, man, I know people who are a quarter his age who tap out after like an hour and a half, right? So that's really, really something.
Yeah, I saw Roger Waters once when I worked at Desert Trip, which was a crazy festival 8-9 years ago. This has been a great conversation. Before we close, I want to give each of you a chance to reflect on the stakes here. What does it mean to make Marx bloom in today's political soil? Whether it's through the lens of humanism, science, or something else entirely, how do we keep that rose from being plucked, paved over, or poisoned by the very stream it's trying to transform?
Well, I'm actually more optimistic than a lot of people are for pessimistic reasons, right? I'm an optimist for pessimistic reasons. There we go. And that's because I think that as long as capitalism exists and produces an enormous amount of unhappiness, people are inevitably going to gravitate towards reading capitalism's greatest critic. It reminds me of this old joke from Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow, right? Where there are these conservatives who have become anti-capitalist, and they're asked, how are you anti-capitalist if you're conservative? And they say, capitalism just keeps on producing all these Marxists, so we got to get rid of it to get rid of the Marxists, right? So I don't think that we have to ever worry that Marx is going to go away. What I wanted to do with this book, and what I think that all of us want to achieve with this book, was to show that Marxism is a very rich philosophy with a lot of different permutations, and it can apply in a lot of different areas of life that you might not expect it to. And if that's what people take away from it, then I'll be really happy it's out in the world.
Yeah, I like that. I think that, I think that, like, I guess the paving that I'm most concerned about is the self-inflicted kind, that, that in sort of leaning into, obscurity or being overly dogmatic about, kind of dying on hills that you don't really need to die on, as far as like defending every last thing the guy ever said, that, like, these are things that, that sort of, obscure, like, the things that are enduring insights and are worthwhile in Marx, right? But what Matt said reminded me of something I saw the other day, which maybe I'll close on, which is Jeffrey St. Clair posted this story from actually Zoran's dad, Mahmoud Mamdani, who of course was an immigrant and came to originally came to the U.S. to study, and got got involved in the civil rights movement, and he said he first Mahmoud Mamdani, who became like a Marxist academic, said he first learned about Karl Marx from the FBI during his interrogation after being arrested at a SNCC protest in Selma.
That was crazy, yeah.
Said they wanted to know who had influenced me. After 1 hour of probing, the guy said, "Do you like Marx?" I said, "I haven't met him." Guy said, no, he's dead. Wow, what happened? No, he died long ago. I thought that Marx guy just died. So then why are you asking me about him if he died long ago? No, he wrote a lot. He wrote that the poor people should not be poor. I said, Sounds amazing.
Why do you guys hate this guy again?
Yeah, it's like that Fox News briefing on like Mom Donnie's socialism, and I remember the last one is like he wants to give everyone fucking baby baskets. It's like, man, they're doing a better job of making the case for his election than he ever did, right? It's like you're gonna actually sit there and be like, look, I understand that some people think that babies are owed something in life, but I really think that if you have a fucking 1-year-old, it's about time they went out there and they got a job and they looked after themselves. I'm fucking tired of all these fucking infants coming there with their hand outstretched, asking me to give them something for nothing.
Exactly.
Everything they've said about this man is just, Look, Flowers for Marx is out now on Revol Press. Wherever you are watching or listening to the show, there's a link in the description. It is the first line in the description to get the book. Thanks again to Ben Burgess and Matt McManus for joining us. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with your comrades, please. We'll see you next time.
See you next time, guys. Peace.
And we are Squawk Was Cartoons out.